everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing green-black in Tarkir Dragonstorm. First, I would like to remind you that the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Now, the data does not like green-black. Abzan and Sultai are the worst performing clans, and green-black is the worst performing enemy-colored pair. So people in general have not been doing well in this space. But I think there's something here. I have not played it a lot, but I had some success recently exploring the space, and it felt very powerful. And I think that what it's doing is pretty unusual for green-black in a way that makes me suspect that what I believe to be the right way to draft it is not how it's drafted in aggregate, which is a good sign when a deck has bad stats, but you want to play it anyway. If it has bad stats and you're trying to do the same thing as everyone else, then there's not really a good reason to expect that it'll work for you where it doesn't work for other people. But if you can explain away the bad stats as, oh, people are probably doing it wrong, and if I do it this other way, then it might work, that at least gives you a solid foundation to explore. So that's the space that I'm in currently. Like I said, I've had some success, but still low sample size. And my current big picture assessment of this format is that I think that it's pretty well balanced and that forcing in general is not where I want to be. I think that this format really rewards knowing how to draft a wide variety of different archetypes and being able to pursue the best cards that you see. So, understanding that it's not a deck to force, where I want to be when I'm green-black is to really lean into the theme, really do the +1/+1 counters thing. And I think that that is a tricky or scary or dangerous way to draft because the cards don't solve their own questions. This is a concept that was actually brought up to me at an LGS a while ago, that at some point, Magic design kind of broadly shifted to cards kind of supporting themselves rather than needing to combine card A and card B, where a card will both, for example, reward +1/+1 counters and grant +1/+1 counters. So you just want more of those cards and it'll just kind of work, as opposed to having different cards that reward +1/+1 counters and then separate cards that grant the +1/+1 counters and needing to find both halves of that. So with green-black in this set, there are some cards that pay off +1/+1 counters, but don't give you the +1/+1 counters themselves, and some cards that give you +1/+1 counters, but maybe not at a rate that is all that appealing if you're not doing anything unique with those +1/+1 counters. And it doesn't feel great to take either of those things early because you don't know if you're going to see the other one. And drafting in the +1/+1 counter space kind of requires a leap of faith that isn't really desirable to make in a set where there's so much going on and where the power level might not be that high, especially for people who know the data and know that this space hasn't been successful. It's why would I speculate on a card that might not get there when I have every reason to believe the ceiling isn't worth the risk? And I think that what that means is that if you just look at the data for green-black, you're not mostly seeing people who did that, because so few people would want to do that. You're seeing people who just took green and black cards and drafted a normal green and black deck. And currently I feel like the payoffs for really getting there on the +1/+1 counter thing are very high. Specifically, I think Synchronized Charge, the updated travel preparations, if you want to think about it that way. 1 and a green, put 2+1/+1 counters on your creatures divided however you want. Notably, you can put 2 on the same one, and then all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, regardless of weather or synchronized charge. Gave them those counters, get trample and vigilance until end of turn, which is a very good set of keywords to give them. It means that you can, definitely attack with all your stuff without fear of counterattack, and your big creatures don't get chump blocked when you make Alpha Strike. Also, it has Harmonize for 4 and a green. Sometimes you'll have to tap a creature for that, sometimes you won't, since it's the kind of card that sometimes you want to cast in late game after you've already made big creatures that just need trample. So that card has been very impressive, and combines super well with the stuff that gives you bonuses for +1/+1 counters, especially Stalwart Successor, the green-black, 1 green-black, 3/2 menace, that whenever a creature gets a counter, it gives it an additional +1/+1 counter. Because now, instead of getting 2 counters for 2 mana and flashing back for 2 more, you're getting 4 counters for 2 mana and flashing back 4 more. 8 is an absurd number of +1/+1 counters for a card to be giving your creatures, especially when it's also giving, up to 4 different creatures, even without any other +1/+1 counters being on your board. So I think that combo is very good at killing people. In general, just synchronized charge is fantastic if you're at all aggressive, and I think that green-black wants aggressive and wants to do that with +1/+1 counters. So notably, that is very unusual for green-black. In most formats, Golgari is more interested in, grinding, doing some recursion, maybe some self-mill type stuff. That is present in this format, but more specifically in Sultai. And I think that straight Golgari or base Golgari decks don't really want to mess around in that space, because the multicolor decks with Dragon Storms and good rares will just go way over the top of anything like that you can be doing. And so you really need to prioritize being aggressive. You really want to curve out. You want, the heavy hitter stuff like Synchronized Charge that lets you push a lot of damage. So last week I talked about how going wide is very good in this format because other people are starting a little bit behind, and there's good removal, and so it can be hard for people to stabilize. The idea here is similar, but from a bit of a different direction. So a lot of the creatures that are being played and that people are trying to stabilize with, or the, card, if you're playing 2, 3, and 4 drops, the bigger creatures that would trump those are mostly dragons. And the thing about the dragons is that they aren't actually that big. A lot of the mana that goes into a lot of the rate offered by the dragons isn't just in their power and toughness. It's in their creature type, the fact that there are synergies with dragons. It's in their omens, so the fact that you can, they're all split cards, not all, but many of them are split cards. It's in their keywords, the fact that they have flying. And so they typically don't have very impressive actual numbers in their lower right-hand corner. Their power and toughness is something that your cheaper creatures can tangle with. If most of the dragons are 3/3s and 4/4s, it's not very hard for Abzan or green-black, or, for green-black creatures with counters to just be bigger than the dragons that people are trying to stabilize with. And if you're the aggressor, the flying aspect of the dragons can just be kind of useless. And so if you curve out with some creatures that are naturally pretty big, maybe have some combat tricks, maybe get some +1/+1 counters on them, the dragons aren't going to work on defense. And so the late game dragon decks are going to have to rely more on their removal. And that's something that you need to be aware of, especially if you're in the space where you're trying to lean into synergies and have, some cards that reward +1/+1 counters and other cards that grant +1/+1 counters. That kind of implies that you're existing in a space where multiple of your cards are working together, which is generally weak against removal, and maybe you're investing 2 cards in a single threat, which again is weak against removal. Fortunately, this archetype gives you access to some cards that play well against removal, and that's Snakeskin Veil and Aggressive Negotiations, which, both give +1/+1 counters and give you a way to play against removal. Snakeskin Veil, you respond to their removal spell, and Aggressive Negotiations, the 2 and a black sorcery that exiles a card from your opponent's hand and puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, lets you preempt their removal by taking it out of their hand, or at least knowing how to plan around the kinds of removal they have. Like, I've played games where I aggressive negotiation, see that my opponent's removal is fight spells, and then just don't let them untap with a creature that would be able to fight with my creatures. Like, prioritize using removal rather than playing an additional creature to remove their creature fight. And so you want to prioritize having some of those cards that give you counterplay to the removal if you're going to lean into the removal. Also, I guess, if you're splashing white, the white trick that gives a +1/+1 counter and indestructible can also exist in space. You also do want some cards that naturally have counters so that you get some counters without needing to have dedicated cards for that. So something like Enoch Wayfarer, the 1 and a green 1/1 that mills 3, and then you can either return a land from the milled cards or put a +1/+1 counter on it, is really good here, especially since this archetype is very interested in creatures with the renew ability. So you're going to get some value out of milling yourself some portion of the time. And I think that you will often want to not pick up a land even when you mill one if you have enough lands to cast your spells, because the counter can just be more valuable. Playing a 2/2 on turn 2 rather than a 2/1 on turn 2 if you're an aggressive deck just gives you a much better position to actually get your opponent dead. And that's especially true if you have other cards that care about the presence of that counter. So I think that Wayfarer kind of wants to be viewed more as a 1/1 creature with a +1/+1 counter that mills 3 than as a Satyr Wayfarer in this deck. But it's also definitely relevant that, if you keep a 2-land hand with this thing, then you can take a land if you need to. Or if you're splashing, it can help with that. So you still, you're going to take, I'm not saying, that you're going to take the land rarely, just that you should actually consider not taking the land when you have the ability to take the land more than you might in most situations. Reputable Merchant, the Abzan Tubrid card, the 2/2 that puts a +1/+1 counter on something when it enters or dies, I think is not great. It does naturally come with a counter, but it's hard to cast. I think it's pretty bad to cast for 4 mana. I don't think it should be a priority. If you happen to be splashing white for other reasons and you happen to pick it up, I think it's fine to play, but I don't think it's very good. Also, if you look just at the stats for performance of cards in green-black on untapped or 17 lands, both sites will show Gurmag Rakshasa, the 4BB 5/5 menace that gives a creature -2/2 and a creature +2/+2 when it enters, as performing pretty well, but I'm very skeptical of it in the deck I want to be drafting here. I'm not really looking for 6 drops. I really want to be more aggressive than that. I think that the stats that show it winning a lot are not representative of people drafting the way that I want to draft. And I think that the fact that it performs so well in this archetype relative to other cards, I would cite as evidence that I really want to be doing something different than what people are generally doing in this color combination where they're not succeeding. So Rakshasa might be good if you're kind of like in a less focused green black space. I think that it, makes a lot more sense in kind of the like grindier Sultai decks that maybe have a little bit more card advantage. So it's easier for them to hit 6 mana and they're kind of trying to play a longer game. But if you're approaching this as kind of the archetype that I'm talking about, which is really like green black counters, then I really don't think that you want to be looking for Gurmag Rakshasa. This is the kind of archetype where if I did want to like really focus on the stats, I would look at opening hand win rate rather than game in hand win rate, because I really want to prioritize early game, and I really need to like get my opponent dead before they do the really powerful things that you can do when you start like going off with Dragon Storms or just like drafting all the rares and casting them or whatever. So like the commons in order of opening hand win rate, just to give you an idea of like the sort of stuff that's going on here. I think that, well, so first I'll just tell you the list and then I'll talk about it. So the best performing in opening hand green black common is Kin Tree Nurturer, the 2 and a black, 2/1 lifelink, endure 1, followed by Aenoch Wayfarer, the 1/1 that mills 3, followed by Champion of Dusan, the 4/2 trample with Renew, followed by Snakeskin Veil, Caustic Exhale, Dragon's Prey, Piercing Exhale, and a huge drop off after that. And while I might want to, prioritize the removal over the creatures, because I think that you're going to see the creatures later, and the creatures are a little bit more replaceable with other creatures, whereas the removal is, more effect. I do think that that's a decent list of the cards that I mostly want to be prioritizing here. So the, cheap efficient removal and the cheap creatures that give you +1/+1 counters. Despite its stats, I would say that I'm a Trade Route Envoy Curious. That's the green 3/4/3 that when it enters either puts a +1/+1 counter on itself if you don't have any +1/+1 counters, or draws a card instead if you do. I think that card's pretty good when you're leaning into +1/+1 counters. Also, Delta Bloodflies, the 1 and a black 1/2 that drains your opponent for 1 when it attacks if you control a creature with a +1/+1 counter. Has very bad stats, but I think that if you are properly supporting it, both with a lot of creatures that, or a lot of ways to get +1/+1 counters, and a generally very aggressive deck, then I think it plays very well in that space. In particular, I would note that I am very enthusiastic about the idea of curving Delta Bloodflies into aggressive negotiation. I think that both of those I think are risky to prioritize early. They both need you to like have a lot of +1/+1 counter support, but fortunately they both go really late. I think you want to try to stay heavily black-green. You're an aggressive deck, it's good to be base 2 colors, but it's reasonable to splash, especially white or blue, of course. This is a format that's, designed to support decks with more than 2 colors and has some tools to do that in aggressive decks. You can play the devotee that corresponds with the color you're trying to splash. I think the devotees are pretty bad if you don't care about their fixing, but rapidly switch to pretty good if you do care about their fixing. And so, you can do some light splashes, but you want to make sure that you're drafting in such a way that supports being able to cast your spells and being able to curve out. And you want to keep your splashes light and keep your strategy very focused on, aggression and the counters and stuff like that. So splash, but splash with caution. Uncommons that I'm looking for, roughly in order of how much I want them, but very roughly. Synchronized Charge, I think has to be the best uncommon for this archetype, followed by Formation Breaker, the 1 and a green 2/1 that gets +1/+2 if you have a +1/+1 counter and can't be blocked by creatures power than it. Dragon Sniper, the 1 mana 1/1 Vigilance Reach Death Touch. It's good to have a 1-drop, and it's a very good place to put counters since it has 7 words. A Traveling Botanist, just a very good rate 2-drop when you're really looking for 2-drops. That's the 2/3 that when it becomes tapped, you look at the top card of your deck and you can mill it or put it into your hand if it's a land. Knockout Maneuver, the fight spell that gives you a +1/+1 counter. Host of the Hereafter. This is like the one card that both synergizes with +1/+1 counters and gives you +1/+1 counters. That design space that I was saying has become a lot more common, but mostly isn't present in this set. This is the 4-mana 2/2 that comes with 2 +1/+1 counters, and when it or something else dies with counters, you can counter somewhere else. Alchemist's Assistant, the 2/1 monkey with lifelink that can renew to give something a lifelink counter. Stalwart Successor, the 3/2 menace that gives an extra +1/+1 counter when you put a counter on something. Yathan Tomb Guard, the 2/3 menace that draws a card whenever a creature with a counter on it damages your opponent. Sage of the Fang, the 3-mana 2/2 that puts a counter on something and can renew to put a counter on a thing and then double the counters. All of those are, good in this deck. Pretty good rate. Those are like the uncommons I'm looking for, as mentioned. Successor and Tomb Guard both get a lot better the more you have the ability to make counters. They're both like a little bit risky to speculate on early, though. Yeah, I mean, they're just a little risky to speculate on early. And once you're in the space, they go up a lot. I do think that the ceiling on Stalwart Successor is very high, even though its stats aren't great. But, I've seen it do some very impressive things. Like, you just don't need to get very many free extra +1/+1 counters for it to be a big deal. And especially if you're like putting counters 3/2 menace for 3, that aggressive creature. Like cards like Winding Constrictor and Hardened Scales are really powerful cards supported and is in that space. So that's what's going on. When an archetype really underperforms, usually it's because often it's because the thing that it's asking people to do is a trap. And I'll talk about, this theme just doesn't work, didn't get there, you shouldn't try to do it. Here, I think it's actually the opposite. I think the theme does work, but I think that it's like scary to draft and mostly not drafted. And I think that the payoff for just kind of moving in on it is something that's worth pursuing. I do think that it's, definitely possible to like take that leap of faith, not see the cards that you're hoping to see, even though they usually go late, and end up with a really bad deck. But I think that because the cards are, for pretty legitimate reasons, generally undesirable right now, that I think it's a gamble that's pretty likely to pay off. So this is definitely a deck that, for the moment, I'm, on the lookout for. I'm definitely not forcing it, but when I see cards that go that way, I'm very open to it. And that's what I have to say about it. So I'm going to give chat the floor now for questions about this. And I do want to thank the newest patrons. So Hital and Charles, thank you very much for the support. And to everyone else, if you have any interest in considering support for the podcast, be sure to check patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Or again, you can very much support the podcast by just talking to your friends about it or leaving reviews on whatever platform you engage with the podcast through. What's the cost over replacement of aggressive negotiations in this archetype and its positioning against 4 and 5 color soup decks? I'm not sure that I understand the exact framing of cost over replacement here. Like, aggressive negotiations is kind of like the only card in its class, and I think that plays at a pretty reasonable rate as long as you can actually take advantage of the counter. I think aggressive negotiations really wants you to have 2-drops, and ideally 2-drops that like have a counter spell well, or use a counter well, and you need a good creature density and stuff like that. But I think that I've generally been pretty happy with the card when I draw it early. People tend to have really powerful cards that you don't have to deal with, and the information that it gives you is really valuable. And when you make your 2 mana creature like scale above an opposing 2 mana or even 3 mana creature while you're doing it, it doesn't feel like you're falling behind as much as you often would when you take a turn off to play a discard spell. I felt the black 2 to 3 drops are quite terrible, while the Formation Breaker, Botanist, Champion of Doosan wears counter naturally very well. Is there any concern with this archetype of being heavier green in the early game and or drawing your counter wearers and counter providers in the order? So, obviously I think that if you really get there on the counters, that the Blood Flies works well, and I think Kin Tree Nurture is pretty good in this archetype. But, you can also like somewhat naturally have a reasonable amount of fixing here. So I'm not that worried about in general, I like to be able to trust the mana in a 2-color deck, especially given the consistency you're expecting from your opponents. As far as drawing your counter wearers and counter providers in the wrong order, I mean, I don't think there's much more of a risk of that than there is, in any deck with like creatures and tricks or fight spells or whatever. You do obviously want to be like a little bit more creature heavy than you might be in some other archetypes to make sure that your like Snakeskin Veils and stuff work. But you can do that, like you can be creature heavy without necessarily being counter enablers light. Like you can just have a lot of Kin Tree Nurturers and Anok Wayfarers and Champion of Dusans and other renew creatures. And again, like those cards usually go pretty late. So the fact that there are a lot of cards that are both creatures and counter providers is kind of like how this all like works out. And like, your Champion of Dusan is a good place to put counters if it's in play. It has trample, and your opponent like wants to trade off with it because it's 4/2 and it has trample, and then it is a source of counters in your graveyard. So I think that there are some cards like that that kind of naturally smooth things over. So it's like, I was talking about how a lot of the cards are either A or B, and you need the right mix of A and B, but the renew creatures do kind of fix that. They like give you both, but they do it in a way that's like subtle and like doesn't feel like great support. But I think that it like complements the stuff that's like more invested pretty well. How do you usually get into green black? I mean, I would hope to get into any color combination in this set by just like starting with good rares or whatever. There are some, counter forward rares that would be a very good reason to like do this. But I also think that like Synchronized Charge is a really good way to get into this. I think that Synchronized Charge is a pretty safe card to first pick that's like good in like any aggressive green deck. And I do think that there are other good aggressive green decks, and that if I start with a Synchronized Charge, then this is a place that I'd be pretty interested in like trying to navigate it if it feels open. If we're playing green black and can't pick up a copy of Aggressive Negotiations, how do you compensate to not lose to random 5+ bombs that negotiations take out of their hand? So I think the card that is most in the same space as Aggressive Negotiations is Snakeskin Veil, since it's another way to like get counters and resist removal. And the solution to their expensive bombs when you don't have discard is just to kill them. That's really plan A. Like a lot of the stuff that you would be worried about is creatures that trump your creatures, but like if you have ways to make your creatures bigger or just like other tricks or whatever, then that's not like much of a concern. And then it's like, okay, but what if they have, like Ugin or Elspeth or whatever? Like, okay, yeah, sure. Sometimes you're going to lose to the Broken Mythics set. Like, there's no way around that. That's just going to happen. And so, I mean, it's the same. Like, if you do have aggressive negotiations, your opponent still might just draw one of them. Like, the best plan against decks that have, better rares than you saw in the draft is to, like, just kill them before they can draw or cast them. And this deck's relatively good at doing that. Are you ever happy to splash for something like the 3/3 Sultai Dragon? What's your mental model for splashing in this archetype? I think that the 3/3 Sultai Dragon is a reasonable card to splash for if you have like a good number of Wayfarers. I'm not very excited about like casting a 4 mana 3/3 flyer in this archetype, but I am pretty excited about like sometimes getting the renew ability for free. I don't think that like that dragon is a big draw to splash for blue, but I think that it's a card that I'm sometimes going to be happy to, have as like an also ran when I'm already in like green black. Do you think the ceiling is high enough for green black to justify all the effort or risk relative to other archetypes? So yesterday I went 7-1 with a straight green black deck that felt great and largely inspired this. And then I went 7-1 with a like green black based deck that didn't really get there on the +1/+1 counter thing as well as I wanted. Ended up being a little bit more Abzan and splashing the Mardu 4/4 haste Death Touch rare, and that deck also went 7-1 and also felt pretty good. And that was like a soft pivot out of this space while still including most of the stuff from this space and still pretty aggressive. And coming off of those, I've felt like the ceiling is pretty high. However, this is an archetype where I'm speaking from my own small experience and from theory rather than like, actual stats and data that back that up. And so my sample size is necessarily small enough that my confidence that it's, repeatable or that you can regularly reach a like high enough ceiling is necessarily pretty low. Anytime I'm, advising going against data, it's like going to be based on things that are necessarily harder to back up because the sample sizes are going to be very small relative to the data that I'm contradicting. So some amount of this is, either trust my guesses and see how it works, or, apply your own reasoning and experiences and decide if the suggestions sound reasonable. But, there's going to have to be some amount of like judgment call involved at some point, whether you want to try this kind of thing when it goes against the data. How many Snakeskin Veils are you looking to play in this archetype? I think it would be very hard to imagine playing 4, but 2 to 3 feels pretty comfortable. 1 sounds like I think that there are appreciable diminishing returns on additional Snakeskin Veils. I think that you're really like looking to cast 1 per game at most. Like that's generally going to do what you want. And if you draw like too early, it's likely to disrupt curving out the way that you want in order to maximize the power of like the Skin Veils that you're on. So I would say, it can be like pretty great high impact play, but you don't want to like go too far on it. If you take the leap of faith and it doesn't work out, how/when do you get out? So, like I said, in the second draft that I did that 7-1 yesterday, like I took some blood flies and ended up short on playables and had to play some blood flies in a deck that only had like 4 ways to put counters on things where they really weren't ideal. But I was able to, pivot into a space that could use some rares that I saw, and it still worked out. I think that, I guess the answer to, in general, how do you pivot out in this format is you see a powerful rare and then you move into like drafting in a way that supports that powerful rare. And I think that, when you're like in pack 2 or 3 and you see a rare that asks you to play another color but offers a lot of power, how interested you are in doing that will depend on how strong your baseline deck is. Like, do I want to increase variance in my mana base in order to accommodate the power level spike from this rare? If my deck's already very good, then I probably don't need to do that. But if my deck is not very good, then that's probably more appealing. So basically, like, the less you are deeply in the theme and synergy, the more open you're going to be to non-synergistic cards that pull you in other directions. And I guess what I'd say is, I touched on the idea that I'm not really looking to force in this format, and that's like very true here. And, also I can look to find a way into a deck and take some cards that would be strong in that deck while still not trying to commit too early and still staying flexible. So I would say, even if you start with a synchronized charge, maybe even follow it up with like slightly early, slightly speculative stalwart successor, that as long as you haven't spent a ton of picks on stuff that like really needs to be in that space, or if it doesn't seem like you're getting there in that space, then I would want to be giving more serious consideration to pivoting out for powerful cards that I see that would want me to like look to a different strategy. You mentioned you really like synchronized charge. How high are you taking this? Are you playing multiple copies, or does the harmonized use fulfill the need for multiple copies? I think the answer is that, so there are some cards, mostly rares and mythics, where it's just like, if you see it in the pack, you should take it, move on with your life, we're done. Then for me, the class below that is like the cards that when I'm drafting in person, like with a paper booster pack, I will pull to the front of the pack as the cards that I expect to be considering. Synchronized Charge is a card that I'm always going to pull to the front of a booster at the beginning of a draft. It will, be a card that I'm considering unless, there's like a Jeskai Revelation or some ridiculous rare, then I'll take that instead. But I think that, it would be reasonable to take it over any common or uncommon if you want to be in this space. Obviously, for the average person, they would probably be better served by taking like one of the top performing like 3-color uncommon dragons, or maybe some of the good Stormbroods or whatever, for synchronized charge. But I think that, if I was watching somebody draft and they opened a pack with synchronized charge and no great rare, and they took synchronized charge over any common or uncommon, I'd be like, okay, I understand that. I see what you're trying to do here. That's fine. And then, are you trying to play multiple copies? Yes, absolutely. Like, once you're in this space, you'd play 5 of them, I think, as long as, the rest of your deck is stuff that, like, wants those. And you have a decent creature count. Is black-green the best home for an admittedly poor card like Adorned Crocodile? I suspect that it's not the best home because it's less invested in 4-5 mana spells and self-mill than like some other Sultai decks. But I do think that Adorned Crocodile is a passable top-end type card in this deck that gets quite a bit better the more Inok Wayfarers you have. So, from the looks of things, it seems like we've covered it. So, I'm going to wrap this up here. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks especially, of course, to everyone in Twitch chat watching live and giving me questions. And I will be back next week with more Dragonstorm coverage. So, have a good week, and bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.